So today I want you to think about this class as learning about a magic trick and then learning how to perform this magic. So the magic that we're doing today is transforming food, which we all know what it looks like, into soil. So how do you get from one to the other in a few weeks' time is basically the magic that we're going to be learning about today. So what is compost? Compost is the finished product of your breakdown of organic matter. And organic matter that we're going to be focusing on today is browns and greens, nitrogen and carbons. We're going to be talking about aerobic composting, and that can look many ways. The pile that we're exemplifying today is called a 3-bin system. The idea behind the 3-bin system is that it's pretty straightforward for beginners, and it gives you a good amount of output of compost with not too much input. You just have to do a couple processes before you get to your finished product. So bin 1 is to input your food scraps. So in composting, what you need is about a 2-to-1 ratio of browns and greens. So when we talk about browns, we're talking about carbon-rich materials, which is mainly comes from trees. So it'd be leaf litter, mulch, it could be paper towels. It could also be dried yard waste, grass trimmings after they're dried and all that. And then greens, which are nitrogen heavy, are your food scraps. And anything else, like sometimes animal manure is high in nitrogen as well. And for our purposes, we usually don't want to put manure from animals that are carnivorous. So like you wouldn't put cat litter in your compost, you wouldn't put dog poop. You could put guinea pig bedding, for example, or rabbit bedding, since they're herbivores, because the meat in their system just throws off the balance of the microbial activity. And the bedding as well is wood chips and grass, and that's good for your carbons. The main idea is you want your particles to be as small as possible. So the more you increase your area, surface area, the faster your breakdown will be. Let's say, for example, you're collecting your food scraps at home and you're putting it in a bag in the freezer, which is an easy option for someone who maybe doesn't tend to their pile every day. It gets it out of the way and it doesn't smell. And then you bring it to your own pile or our pile for drop off. You want to make sure that you put double that amount in browns, because what happens is, if you think about it this way, what happens when you leave a banana peel or rotten food out on the table? Very quickly it's going to break down, melt, it's going to rot. And that's because nitrogen particles, they like to move very, very fast. So imagine that they're stuck inside of this pepper and they want to get out, they want to break down, they want to do something. And so they're going to run around and they're going to melt away, and it's not going to be pretty very soon. In the compost pile, you want double the amount of browns to nitrogens, because the nitrogen moves very fast and it needs the right amount of browns to break down and trigger digestion, which is where we're going to be talking about heat. To layer, let's talk about starting a pile at home, like a pile in your garden. So you would start with probably leaf litter, stuff that takes a long time to break down, sticks, dried grass. You would start with that, and then you would layer your food scraps on top. It depends how much you have, but however much you have that day, you put it all there. You might even want to break up the brown bag that it came in as small as you can, and always make sure that the top of your compost pile has browns on it. This will A, deter animals from coming and eating your pile, and B, it'll stop the release of methane from the food scraps. So one thing about composting, right, is that we're essentially recycling down the organic components in your food and in your yard waste. So when food gets thrown in the trash and sits in a landfill, it releases methane because it has nowhere to go. It's not breaking down, it's rotting. A straightforward way, the 3-bin system, think about it in terms of fresh, fractional, finished. If you have a system like this, you're going to input, and it can be smaller than this. We just used pallets because they're easy to find and cheap. Rabbit wire so that the particles don't fall in between, because it's also easy to find. And this gives you about 16 square feet, which at the end gives you a good amount for your garden. If you're doing a pile like this is your input pile. So when you have your fresh food scraps or your carbons, you're going to input them into pile 1. Then essentially you're going to flip that in a week or 2 into pile 2. So you don't input fresh material into pile 2, you're just flipping from pile 1. And this is our fractional bin. So that means that the food items in here should kind of look identifiable, but you should be seeing a breakdown of your materials in bin 2. That's why it's called fractional. What we have going on, we've changed our system right now, so this is not technically what it should look like. This is kind of what bin 1 should look like, because it should be your fresh materials, your egg cartons. You should be able to see like, oh, that's the egg I ate this morning, and the cardboard box from Amazon. In pile 2, it would more so look like this. It's breaking down, but it's not fully broken down. If I digged a little deeper, I would be able to find some recognizable food objects. After a couple of weeks and after a little bit of turning, because what we're doing is we're trying to go for an aerated or thermophilic pile, and that is because if you have an anaerobic pile, it creates a different form of microbes, because what's going on in here is the food and the yard waste, the carbons and nitrogens, are interacting and breaking down. The microbes are feeding off of the food, and the carbons are balancing that off by making it go not so fast. If you think about your nitrogen as a gas pedal and your carbon as a brake. So in your pile, and we'll talk about troubleshooting, there can be things like it's smelly, it's too wet, and those are signals that your pile is off balanced. You want your compost, all 3 systems, especially the last bin, to smell earthy, sweet. It shouldn't have a bad odor, and all piles should be moist enough where you can take the items, squeeze them, and they should hold their shape in your hand. Once you wiggle your hand, it should fall apart. So you always want it to retain its moisture, but not be too wet and never be too dry, because a lot of microbial life and worms and nematodes and all those bigger arthropods that are going through your pile will not be able to survive if it's dry. They need some moisture, and they really like the moisture. Let's say you have a smaller pile in your house, in your backyard, which probably is the most realistic thing that you can have. You're going to layer your yard scraps with your food scraps. Always put your browns on top, and then if you are able to get a thermometer, this is one by Rio Temp, which they handle, they do compostable item. They do have compost education items. You can get a thermometer like this or any other long thermometer, and really you want to be able to track the degree of your pile, because the degree where you're going to have the most breakdown would be between 100 and 130 or 40. We don't want to get too hot, because if we get hotter than 140, you're actually going to kill a lot of your microbial life. There was a story told to me by a farmer I knew in New York. They had a big enough pile, and it got so hot, it got to 160 degrees, and they were able to open it up, throw a whole pig in it, and it would cook in the pile. Which is one way to reuse that heat, right? Another way to reuse the heat is running pipes underneath your compost pile. You can run one with water, and then you get like 120-degree water without any electrical input, or you can run air in it and heat your greenhouse or your house with your compost pile. So there's many ways to reuse the energy that we're creating simply by eating, simply by living, right? So though compost is expensive to buy in bulk, it's free and easy to make. One way we can replenish the soil is if you garden or farm. Garden in a way that replenishes what you take from the soil, so you can look up permaculture practices. You can always plant diverse amount of crops, and then you replenish your soil and your nutrients by fertilizing your land with compost. It almost just happens by itself. I'm sure we've all done it by accident, maybe. Pile of leaves in your yard, you come back a couple months later and it's kind of broken down and it's looking nice and fine, and you reuse it. Now it's going to happen naturally, but if we can sort of use it to our advantage, then you will A, save money, B, you'll be able to supply yourself and others with usable soil, because everyone's looking for compost these days. And C, you're feeding back to your garden what you're taking from it. So think of it as a closed loop system. So you're eating things, everything comes from the ground, everything comes from the soil. You're using it, you're discarding the scraps, and then the scraps want to go back into the ground. They want to go back to where they came from. So all we're doing is just allowing that process to happen. Has anyone ever seen piles like these that are on your sheet before? Yeah. So basically, these are just ways that we're helping the process that will naturally happen occur. Does anyone ever heard of vermicomposting? That's basically composting with the addition of worms. And you would add worms because they accelerate the breakdown process. Red wigglers can actually eat half their weight in food in a day. So if you weigh out your food scraps, let's say you have 5 pounds of food scraps in a week, you would need about 10 pounds of worms, to cover that in a week. And there's actually websites where you can buy worms in bulk. So that's what we've done. We've created this vermicompost bin, which it sounds like you have something similar to this. This is just a regular toter that you drill holes into for aeration. You don't necessarily need to drill them in the bottom, but as close as possible so water doesn't pool. Then you fill it up with the same items you would your compost, so greens and browns. Worms really like to live and reproduce in cardboard and eggshells, and then they eat all your organic matter. And they accelerate the breakdown of your compost because of their eating and digestion. And then their poop, which is called worm castings, is actually a really, really healthy fertilizer. So worm populations are very social, and they will also reproduce only to the amount that they can sustain themselves. So if you're running out of food, and they know that, they will slow down their reproduction rate. If there's plenty of food, I believe they will double their population in 3 months if you let them. And so if you buy a small bag of worms and you wanted to start a vermicompost, you can actually accelerate that process by providing the right amount of food, and then you'll have more and more worms eventually. If you do it right, you can even give some away. I do know that worms can eat coffee grounds. You just never want to put too much of one thing. So you never want to put too much citrus, you never want to put too much onions, but we're going to talk about it in a second. One thing is organic matter that passes through a worm's body has 50% more organic matter. So food that passes through a worm's body has 50% more organic matter, which is one of the reasons that worm poop, worm castings are so good for your garden. So if you didn't have an outdoor space and you wanted to create some of your own soil, even for indoor pots, you could do an indoor vermicompost bin. And I would probably refer to some YouTube videos for that, because there is a way that they say you should start off your bin to have the right microbiome for your worms so they don't all escape as soon as you put them in there. For our purposes, we have that just to maintain, and eventually you pour it out, you dig through it, you take out the fertilizer, and you separate the worms, and then you add more, and they'll keep doing their thing. Now with the compost pile, it does take a little bit of time. The hotter your temperature, your ambient air temperature, the faster the microbial process will happen. So down here, it should happen pretty quickly. You want to keep your pile turned. So what you would do in a pile like this probably is, if you can stick a gardening fork in it and turn it, you have to do a really thorough turn. What I end up doing is removing kind of the top half and stirring it up, taking what I need from that one, turning it to the second bin, the stuff that's breaking down, and then adding whatever we need more, replenishing the first pile, and putting it all back. And you want to keep it turning so that you don't get anaerobic, because one way you might know it's anaerobic is if it starts to smell, or if it becomes too wet, or if you see things that are like molding. It shouldn't mold. There's a difference between rotting and breaking down. And so you want your aerobic pile. You don't want a static pile. Some things that you want to avoid putting in the compost would be meat items. I know some like big composting facilities might be able to take meat and compostable items, but that's because their process is big enough where they might have a higher heat but less microbial activity, and they might have, you know, like special machines to turn their pile or however. In a backyard pile, we're never really going to get hot enough to break down meat before it starts to rot. So you want to try to keep meat items, cooked items with a lot of oil out of your pile, and you don't want a surplus of citrus in your pile, because citrus has citric acid, which can harm the balance of your compost pile. Onions are okay, but you don't want too many of these as well, because they contain a potent sort of, you know, they might make your compost cry, who knows. But eggshells are really good for your pile. So they contain calcium, and basically the more diverse your nutrients are in your input, the more diverse your compost is going to be. So if you have a garden, you want to try to put as many different plants as possible. Ideally, things like oat straw and hay is really good. You ever get those, it's called sticky cleavers, the cleavers that kind of stick to you, they have little barbs. Those are actually medicinal. They have a lot of they have properties in them. Those would be good to put in your compost. Nettle, has anyone ever grasped nettle? Been, you know, barbed by their little barbs? Nettle actually is like a powerful plant. It contains proteins, it contains potassium, magnesium, and all that, if you put that in your pile, will help it break down. Comfrey leaves as well are a high source of potassium. So the more diverse your input, the more diverse your output, basically. Does everyone understand how nitrogen and carbon comes together to form heat and all that? I explain it like, think about your guts. So internally, our body temperature is 98.6. That's pretty hot, right? And that's because our body is working. Our stomach is digesting. We have microbes in our gut that are actually eating the food for us and digesting, and that's why that's why we're alive, right? We have heat in us. The same exact thing is going on in the pile. So there are microbes in here that are doing the work for us. They're eating the food for us. They're digesting, they're working, and they create heat and they create gases. And that's why when you have a working compost pile, then you're going to have heat, and that's a good sign. not too hot and not too cold. If it ever snows by you, you'll see that your compost pile is the only thing in your yard that doesn't have snow. Might even be giving off steam. If it ever does get too hot, which it can, compost can catch on fire. So you never want to leave it too dry, and you never want, especially if it's dry and you have leaves on top and buds on it, it can combust if it's too hot. But if it's too hot, that's something you should take note of beforehand and try to pump the brakes on it. Cool it down, aerate it, mix it, and add water. We have a compost drop-off. We are a compost drop-off site now with Compost Now. And on the back of one of these, I believe Dimitri put all the compost drop-off schedules. We have some all over the city. So if you are new to saving your food scraps and diverting your food waste, I would start with putting your food scraps in a bag and putting them in the freezer, and then bringing them to one of these drop-off sites. And then eventually you can move into figuring out how to make a compost work for you in your home. There's ways to have a vermicompost bed, or bin rather, like under your sink. You can have an indoor one that works pretty efficiently once you get the ratios right, and then you can literally be recycling down your food waste in your own home. How cool is that? So cool. Your third and final pile should always look rich, dark, homogeneous. You shouldn't really be able to tell one thing from the other. You should just be able to see soil, a worm, and nothing that you should recognize, because that means that those should be in the other two piles. Or if you have one pile, you keep mixing it up, and usually your rich humus type things are at the bottom, and you would take that out and then keep mixing. Save your yard scraps, leaves. Leave the leaves next to your bin, and always make sure to cap off with leaves. And first step is diverting your food waste from the trash. So I believe you all can do it.